Okay, so welcome to the penultimate session on towards the end of the Marxist Grundrisse, and I hope you've enjoyed the ride. I imagine it's a bit bumpy at times, but I thought I would start, however, this week with an observation about Marx's technique of stringing together ideas and putting things into motion. And the easiest way to do this is to look at how Marx proceeds in Capital, Volume 1. He starts the text with the concept of the commodity. Well, you can look at a commodity, feel it, understand it, all this kind of stuff. So it's a unitary sort of concept. But then he says, when you're dealing with market exchange, you have to understand the commodity has a dual aspect. It has a use value and an exchange value. And these two concepts are opposed to each other. If you have a house and you want to live in it, you can't sell it. If you sell it, you can't live in it. So there is an antagonism, if you like, between the use value and exchange value. And then Marx looks at it and says, well, what can we say about capital looking at that binary between use value and exchange value? And he says, well, we can look at all of the use values and we can study them, and people will be using knives and forks and cars and everything. But actually, what we'll get is a tremendous variety of things which could be used in any mode of production, so we won't learn anything specific about capital by the study of use values. So we look at the study of exchange values. And you say, well, actually this is very helpful because capital is very much about exchange value, so we're going to study how the exchange value works. And when we look at it, we see something very interesting, which is a tremendous heterogeneity of use values and a single metric which is governing exchange values. So everything must be measurable on the same measuring rod. And so what is it that all those heterogeneous commodities have in common? Well, says Marx, they're products of human labor. So we come up with the idea that the relevant thing which binds together the use value and the exchange value is that they are human labor, and we're going to call that human labor value. And at that point he then kind of says, well, what kind of labor is it that it gets congealed in commodities that forms the measuring rod? What kind of what is it that we have here? And this is the point where Marx immediately kind of says, well, actually, there are two kinds of labor you can look at. And he says there's concrete labor and abstract labor. The concrete labor is the actual number of hours that you might spend on making something. The abstract labor is the average number of hours of everybody making the same product. So when you go into the market, even if you spend 6 hours making something, if the average in the market is 4 hours, you're only going to get 4 hours. So Marx says, well, actually, abstract labor is what is most important here, because that's what you're going to get in the market, not the concrete labor. So this stops me increasing what I get in the market by extending the number of hours. I mean, if it's simply hours, as Proudhon wanted, then of course it would be good if I spent 10 hours making something that everybody else made in 1. I would get 10 and they would get 1. No, that's not how it works in the market. So it's at that point that what is it then that brings this stuff together? Well, it's the act of exchange. And then the act of exchange is creating this measure of value. And we see an infinite number of exchanges, and we then ask a question about how these things kind of relate to each other. And he then says, well, look, we can divide this now into a binary which is relative exchange and a universal exchange. And this then is another binary, and the relative and the equivalent form of exchange are actually present in the market. And then there comes a question of, well, what is this equivalent about? And if you move away from a barter system to a market system, then what is the market mechanism? Well, the relative and the equivalent creates something called a general equivalent, and the general equivalent then erupts as money. And then you kind of say, oh, so now we've resolved that contradiction between relative and equivalent by the rise of the money form. Well, money also has multiple dualities. It's a medium of circulation. It's a measure and store of value. So again, you start to look at that, and you kind of say, well, actually, as a medium of circulation, it does certain things, but as a measure of value, it does something else. And so at that point, Marx kind of says, so what would a money commodity look like? And you look at something like gold, and you say, well, actually, gold is very good at measuring value and storing value. So if you want to store value, you get a gold ingot or a gold necklace or something like that and stick it under the bed or whatever, so you can store value with it. On the other hand, gold is very bad in terms of actual exchange. If every time I had to take a cup of coffee, I had to find a little grain of gold to pay you with, it would be impossible. So Marx then kind of says, well, so it's the equivalent form of value, and this equivalent form is two-faced. So you see what Marx is doing here. And right throughout Capital, he keeps on doing this. He keeps on going from unified concept to a binary. And the binary is about contradiction and antagonism. And you can't, and this is Marx, if you like, his version of the dialectic, because the dialectic is unfolding. It doesn't come to a synthesis, all right? It consolidates into something like money, but when it comes into money form, then it immediately splits again, and then you go on, and then you get the distinction between market circulation and the movement of capital and binary. So this is Marx's technique. And in volume 1 of Capital, of course, you end up with the concept of surplus value, and you say, well, there's absolute surplus value and there's relative surplus value. And so this is the tactic. Now, what we've been involved in over the past 2 or 3 weeks has been a big bifurcation between fixed and circulating capital. So it's in a sense this. So you have to locate this bifurcation between fixed and circulating, and recognize that it's something that comes out of this kind of whole argument. And therefore the question then arises, well, what can we say about fixed and circulating capital? Which of these is the most adequate form of expression of what capital is about? And I think it's interesting there to go back and look at a certain passage, because he is being very explicit about it. This is on page 313 of my text, and it's page 694. In the actual text. So Marx says about fixed capital that the accumulation of knowledge and of skill and the general productive forces of the social brain is thus absorbed into capital, and more specifically of fixed capital. It then appears as if it is machinery that is the most adequate form of fixed capital and in the most adequate form of capital as such. But here the analysis crashes into a contradiction. He's been exploring one side of the bifurcation, which is fixed capital, and largely sort of treating the circulating capital as being rather dormant. But now he says, but here the analysis crashes into a contradiction. Insofar as fixed capital is condemned to an existence within the confines of a specific use value, it does not correspond to the concept of capital. Because remember, capital should be indifferent, right? So it does not correspond to the concept of capital, which, as value, is indifferent to every specific form of use value and can adopt or shed any of them as equivalent incarnations. Fixed capital is entirely defined by its use, and uses are contingent and flexible. The problem with fixed capital is that it is fixed, whereas circulating capital is about fluidity, flexibility, transformation, and motion. This is my take on it. Fixed capital gums things up and holds things down. It is therefore, says Marx, circulating capital, which appears as the adequate form of capital and not fixed capital. Increasing reliance on fixed capital condemns capital to a sclerotic future. I mean, if we only lived in a world of fixed capital, it wouldn't, nothing would change. And so Marx is very aware that he's dealing with a contradiction here between fixed and circulating capital. But this notion of contradiction is the result of a long chain of contradictions running throughout the whole analysis, which takes you through relative and absolute surplus value, you know, all those kinds of things. So what Marx now does in this section we're just coming into is he's kind of really pushed very hard to try to understand fixed capital in itself, right? And as I've said, he sort of deals a bit with circulating capital, but it's pushed to one side and not considered so important. It sort of becomes subservient, if you like, to the main question, which is, what is this fixed capital and what is it that fixed capital does for us? But now he's kind of saying, he says this, henceforth, from this page on, capital is, he says, posited as the unity of production and circulation within the totality. So Marx now sets out to explore the contradictory unity between production and circulation, which obviously reflects something about the contradictory unity between fixity and fixed capital and circulating capital. And of course, this, however, has now to be put in a context where fixed capital is having a powerful effect upon circulating capital, because it is through fixed capital that circulating capital increases the productivity of the labor it employs. So there's a relational thing between fixed and circulating capital, which is very significant, and we're now going to look at them taken together and look at the consequences for what happens. In other words, this unity which Marx is setting up between fixed and circulating capital is going to produce a contradiction, which then is going to actually then take us further on into the text. And you know roughly where he's going from what he said earlier. We're going to end up inside the credit system, because fixed capital can't work without the credit system. Fixed capital requires the credit system. It requires a circulation of interest-bearing capital, and there we're going to get into that will be the next step. And it's interesting that since Marx doesn't complete this, it makes me wonder what would be the next step after fixed and circulating capital, and you've gone through all of the things that are associated with that, which are quite complicated, as we will see. But then what happens when you go after that? One thing I would bet on is that actually one of the things that's going to be in opposition is a distinction between fictitious and real capital. And fictitious and real capital is something that doesn't come up in the Grundrisse, but it does come up a bit in Volume 3 of Capital, and it's something which I think is incredibly important is very much what, you know, when you say what do hedge funds do, and how do hedge funds sort of do things in private equity and so on, what do they do, how do they accumulate capital? Well, they do it through fictitious pathways. And Marx himself at some point or other kind of says, well, accumulation suddenly appears like it's an accumulation of debt, an accumulation of hot air almost. And what does that do to the nature and the dynamics of a capitalist mode of production? That would be my guess and my bet, or where I would take it. You may take it somewhere else, but my point here is to say, when you get used to the idea that what Marx is doing is making this kind of bifurcations and unifications, you then actually get a better sense of where we're at. So now we're into this notion of, well, okay, in the same way that absolute and relative surplus value at some point, Marx says in Capital, well, actually there's only one surplus value. What Marx is going to do here is to say, well, we have this contrast between fixed and circulating capital, but at this point we actually have to understand them as a contradictory unity, as opposed to completely separate and isolated elements of the situation. Now, what he does is to say that he starts out with this kind of discussion of what goes on within the totality. Look, what Marx wants to do is now to look at the positionality of fixed and circulating capital within the totality. And what this really does is to take us back inside of that original diagram I gave you. And if you go back and look at that diagram, you remember the totality of it. And what Marx is doing is saying, I'm now looking at this as a flow, from money capital to the purchase of commodities, through production, going to market, being distributed, once it's in money form, to the various things, and then coming back in. So we've got that circulation process going on. And now, instead of thinking of surplus value as somehow or other the key thing you have to look at, you understand surplus value as a moment in that big circulatory process. Okay? And surplus value rests within all this total circulatory process. So what was actually a major topic of investigation earlier in the text now gives way to, well, it gets reduced to being just simply a moment in the total circulation process of capital. And that total circulation process of capital entails the conjoining of fixed and circulating capital within the market. And what this does, of course, is to say that capital is not really simply about surplus value. It's about reinvestment in the production of surplus value. So the moment of reinvestment starts to become rather critical. And so he kind of says, what this means is this: that insofar as the newly posited value is itself in turn taken up into the production process, itself in turn maintains itself as capital, to that extent the capital itself has grown and now acts as a capital of greater value. So we're now beginning to understand why it is that the capitalist system is expansionary, always, and is therefore going to be perpetually expanding. By describing all of this, hence capital, grown by the amount of the profit, now begins the same process anew in larger dimensions. By describing its circle, it expands itself as the subject of the circle, and thus describes a self-expanding circle, a spiral. Now, the diagram I gave you is about the circle. It's about the cycle. And I've often been challenging people to give me a diagram which actually talks about how that gets converted into a spiral. What would the diagram look like? But now you've got to imagine that process that you're talking about is a spiral. And that is therefore about, as it says in Volume 1 of Capital, accumulation for accumulation's sake, production for production's sake. It's going to be inevitably expansionary. And therefore the mass is going to continuously increase because surplus value is going to be reinvested in the creation of more surplus value. And it is that moment of production of surplus value which cannot be understood outside of the realization of surplus value through the market and the flow through the whole thing. So this is how Marx starts to talk about it. And we go from a situation of what Hegel called a virtuous infinity. And that is very much of the cyclical form. The sort of thing you have in mind here is to say, well, you know, if you look at the rotation of the Earth and the night and day are following each other, and they continue to follow each other, there you have what Hegel would call a virtuous infinity. That you can imagine that night and day will go on for as long as, you know, the sort of cosmos lasts. So you can kind of say that's a virtuous infinity. It doesn't actually have any growth attached to it. Whereas the bad infinity is the spiral form, which is that says that you're going to have to expand exponentially over time. I mean, each time you go around that circular process, you add more surplus value to produce more surplus value, and that is the nature of what capital is about. And what this does is the following: that from the perspective of the totality, that is of that diagram that I gave you at the beginning, from the perspective of the totality, capital appears as if it is self-replicating, searching for profit and building endlessly upon the spiral form of growth. But within that form, it encounters some serious contradictions. The rate of profit, which is very much about the rate of extraction of surplus value, the rate of profit depends on the relation between the part of capital exchanged for living labor, what he will ultimately refer to as variable capital, and the part existing in the form of raw material and means of production, which he eventually terms constant capital. It's that relationship between variable and constant capital, between labor and means of production. Hence, he says Marx, the smaller the portion exchanged for living labor becomes, the smaller becomes the rate of profit. In other words, the more the relative surplus value grows, the more does the rate of profit fall. You're increasing the productivity of labor, you need fewer laborers. If you can produce the same amount of product by cut your labor force in half, which is what fixed capital allows you to do, if you can do that, then there's much less labor being employed. And if labor is the source of value, much less value is being created. And therefore, at the end of the day, much less surplus value. So in the end, the rate of profit is going to fall. So that there's a tight connection between the theory of relative surplus value and the falling rate of profit. Okay? So this is what Marx is saying here. As he says, while the part exchanged for living labor decreases, then the surplus value ultimately declines. But here Marx notes a very odd thing. Presupposing that the equal relation of surplus labor and necessary labor, which is, in other words, keeping the rate of exploitation constant, presupposing this, there can therefore be an unequal profit, and it must be unequal relative to the size of the capitals. The gross profit, which is the mass of the profit, will grow on the average, not as does the rate of profit, but as does the size of the capital. Here comes a very important, simple and obvious observation which everybody forgets. A capital of 100 with a rate of profit 10% yields a smaller sum of profit than a capital of 1,000 with a profit of 2%. This is an obvious but all too frequently ignored fact. And then Marx does this. This is a typical Marx trick. He kind of imagines three scenarios about the relationship between the rate of profit and the mass of profit. If the rate of profit declines for a larger capital, but not in relation with its size, then the gross profit, or the mass of profit, rises, although the rate of profit declines. If the profit rate declines relative to its size, then the gross profit, mass of profit, remains the same, and that of the smaller capital remains stationary. If the profit rate declines more than its size increases, then the gross profit of the larger capital decreases relative to the smaller one in proportion as its rate of profit declines. This, in every respect, he says, the most important law of modern political economy. So he's given three scenarios. One is the rate of profit falls, but the mass of profit increases because the capitalist employs more labor. If the mass of profit compensates for the falling rate of profit, then it comes out even. If the mass of profit does not increase sufficiently to overcome, then you get a decline. So the effectiveness of the rate of profit depends upon the mass. And the mass is about employing more laborers. Now, what are capitalists most interested in? A high rate or a large mass? Which would you rather have? Well, one of the things that Marx points out at the very beginning is that the first law, if you like, is that the capitalist is interested in the mass. One of the ways you can increase the mass is, of course, to jack up the rate. The other way is to increase the number of laborers you employ, in the face of the fact that the laborers are becoming more productive. And there's no reason why you can't. And in effect, what Marx is doing here is now saying, you're now going to talk about the origins of mass production and mass consumption. Because it's the pursuit of the mass that matters. How do we measure the power of a nation state? Why do we say the United States is the most powerful economic country in the world? It's because it has a greater mass than anybody else. Who has the second amount of mass? China. Who's the big rival of the United States? China. Why? Because it has a big mass. And if you use purchasing power parity, you find actually China has a larger economy than the United States, which freaks people out. Absolutely, totally freaks people out. So nobody wants to talk about purchasing power parity. It's got to be market exchange rate. So the mass then becomes very, very significant. Then this phrase right at the end of this paragraph, which he says, this, in every respect, the most important law of modern political economy. Now, there's always an ambiguity in a statement of this kind. First off, you don't know whether Marx is saying that for him this is the most important law, or for classical political economy this was the most important law. For Ricardo, for example. So is this Marx speaking about himself and his own view, or is he talking about Ricardo's view? And you can't actually clearly tell. My guess is he's talking about Ricardo's view, but leave it to that. Now, this statement, that this is the most, every respect, the most important law of modern political economy, is frequently cited in the literature, because the literature, Marxist literature, particularly in economics, is full of arguments about the falling rate of profit. Actually, you know, there's a huge literature, and many people saying the major form of crisis is the falling rate of profit, falling rate of profit, falling rate of profit. And frequently, they go back to this statement and say Marx himself called this the most important law of modern political economy. Well, I have somewhat of an objection to that, because the wording is, this is in every respect the most important law of modern political economy. What does this refer to? Does it refer to the statement about falling rate of profit, which is 2 pages earlier? Or does this refer to what he's just said about, the rate of profit declines for a larger capital, but not than its size, then the mass of the profit rises? That's what he's referring to. I mean, normally when you say you have a paragraph and you end it with this is the most important, you say what was in the previous paragraph is what is being referred to, not something that's 2 pages before. So I argue that under the usual conditions of interpretation, that this would be presumed to refer to the argument set out in the passage cited above. The context of this would then be the relation between the rate and the mass of profit. But in much of the Marxist literature, the statement is presumed to refer to the falling rate of profit alone. Most economists and many Marxists tend to favor the study of rates of change. And I use an example of the Bank of England, which did a very detailed study of the impacts of quantitative easing on the distribution of income in Britain. And what they've discovered was that the 10% of the least wealthy households saw a marginal increase in their measured real wealth of around £3,000 between 2006 and 8 and 2012 and 14, compared to £350,000 for the wealthiest 10%. So the bottom 10% got £3,000 extra. The top 10% got £350,000 extra. Now, I look at that and I immediately say, see how quantitative easing benefited the upper classes. Hugely. But the Bank of England report came to the opposite conclusion. The UK's Gini coefficient, they wrote, which is a commonly used measure of wealth inequality, declined slightly. The £3,000 received by the least well-off was proportionately more given their initial average wealth than the £350,000 received by the wealthiest 10%. But Marx already asked the question, but in what sense is it better to receive a 10% increase on £100 as opposed to a 5% increase on 1 million? £3,000 over 6 years is less than £10 a week, which hardly adds anything to a person's well-being. The wealthiest in Britain got more than £1,000 a week, which is significant. Over 6 years, the difference would be between a few extra cups of coffee a week for the least well-off, or having enough money to buy a studio apartment in Manhattan for the top 10%. If money is a key form of social power, then a low rate of return on a huge mass of wealth, such as that of Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, confers an enormous increase in social power relative to someone who fashions a high rate of return on a small stash of capital. Exclusive concentration on rates, rather than mass, introduces a systematic bias into economic analysis, and you can see the BOV said you've got to think in terms of rates, and that's what it does. So when Marx declares that statement is in every respect the most important law of modern political economy, and then goes on to say, and the most essential for understanding the most difficult relations, it is the most important law from the historical standpoint, is a law which, despite its simplicity, has never before been grasped and even less consciously articulated. For instance, if the bottom 10% have almost zero wealth, all you've got to do is give them $10 and you've got a huge increase. So the rate is irrelevant compared to the mass. And in Capital, what Marx does is to start off talking about the falling rate of profit, and then about 5 pages in, he then kind of says, but we've got to deal with the rising mass. And he says we have a dual law, a law of falling rate and rising mass. And falling rate and rising mass is important. And how the mass rises is going to be significant. And Marx kind of says it means that you've got to have excess labor. And you've got to have super expansionary markets. You've got to have mass production. You've got to have mass consumption. And the drive for mass production comes from this attempt to get to the mass. Now, this thing about the mass came up in another context, which is very interesting. In 2018, before the pandemic struck, China's growth rate had come down from something like above 10% in the late 1990s and into 2000. It had come down to about 5.6%. And everybody in the Financial Times and everywhere else was kind of going, this is a little bit shocking. This is the constriction of China. Just recently, there was an estimate of what China's rate of growth was going to be over the next year or two, and it was something like 3.4%. And everybody God, China's in falling rate of, this is, went from 12% rate of growth or 10% rate of growth in 2000 to 5% in 2018, and it's down to 3.4%. And you say, well, this shows that the Chinese economy is failing rather badly. That was what the press was saying. In 2018, somebody wrote an article in which they pointed out this was just not the case. And it was not the case for the following reason. What the Chinese were interested in was to increase employment. Because the one thing China is very concerned about is unemployment, mass unemployment. So their target is job creation. And back in 2000, they needed to create about 10 million jobs. That's what they aimed to do in 2000, 10 million jobs. In order to create 10 million jobs, you had to expand by 12%. In 2018, China's economy was large enough that you could get 10 million jobs by expanding with 5%. So the correspondent of the Financial Times pointed out the Chinese government is not worried by this lack of growth because they're not looking at rates, they're looking at employment. And the last data that came out, about 3%, I haven't seen the details of it, but what it said was something very interesting, which was in the back of it, it said they have an objective of creating 10 million jobs. So the point here is that in order to create 10 million jobs, you needed 12% rate of growth in 2000. You need 5 or 6% rate of growth in 2018, and you need a 3.5% rate of growth now. So this is why the rate and the mass is important, that a much lower rate on a much larger mass. That the mass in 2000 was so restricted and so small that you needed that high rate of growth. But as the mass of the Chinese economy has grown, so the lower rates of growth become acceptable, given what China's targets are. And I'm not totally sure this is the case, but one of the targets I know has to be job creation and reasonably full employment. Yeah, there are other issues about the nature of that employment and so on. But so here too, the fact that the mass is increasing and has been increasing of the economy makes a big difference to what the rate must be in order to have certain policies. Now, I go back now a little bit to this question, when this issue of, is Marx, when he's talking about the falling rate of profit, talking about his own theory, or is he talking about Ricardo? Ricardo had a falling rate of profit theory. And the mechanism was very interesting. It was slightly indebted to Malthus. And it went something like this, that as an economy grows, the capitalist economy grows, so the food supply is going to have to come from less fertile lands. So there's going to be falling agricultural productivity, because you're moving on to less fertile lands. And at the same time, there's going to be much more scarcity. So that you're going to see rising prices of food. And at the same time, there's going to be rising extractions of rent from the landlord class. The working class is going to demand higher wages because food is becoming more expensive. So in the end, you find that industrial capital gets squeezed by increasing demands for higher wages by workers in order to be able to eat, and at the same time, a diminishing capacity to satisfy the needs of the working population because you're expanding onto... So Ricardo had this falling rate of profit, and he was very pessimistic about the future of capital. He actually kind of said that, capital would have its day and do a lot of the things that it was doing and do it very well, but inevitably at some point or other, it was going to run into a falling rate of profit situation, a profit squeeze, as we would call it, a profit squeeze from rising demands for labor and from constrictions in supply. So that was Ricardo's view. Marx comments that, and Ricardo went on to kind of say, well, this is where crises come from. And Marx kind of comments that, when Ricardo faces up to the fact that the crisis is likely to occur, he takes refuge in organic chemistry and so on. Makes kind of Marx's theory of falling rate of profit comes from inside of the dynamics of a capitalist system. Ricardo's theory is exogenous, outside. It's the outside forces that clamp down. Marx it's the internal contradictions which do it. And the internal contradiction is that one which is based on relative surplus value. And relative surplus value, which automatically creates a tendency for a falling rate of profit, which can only be compensated for, says Marx. Well, no, actually, there's several ways it can be compensated for, but one of the most important things is that capitalists will, faced with a falling rate of profit, will go out and find ways to employ more labor in order to jack up the surplus value from more labor. And Marx's version of this falling rate of profit is drawn from a lot of the information we've gathered already about what happens when you employ more and more fixed capital. Now, this question of rates and masses, I wrote an article about it, if you're interested, back in New Left Review, which got a typical Marxist response, and people saying I didn't know what I was talking about. But anyway, it's fun. You can go to New Left Review and see it. And basically, it is about rates and masses and saying, well, we're misreading Marx chronically when we start to say it's all about the rate of profit and not about the rising mass. And I think it was terribly important to do the rising mass side of it very strongly, because most of the big social issues we have these days have to do with the mass rather than with the rate. And I don't think capital really cares too much about the rate, except insofar as increasing the rate and finding a high rate is one of the ways in which you can increase the mass. At the end of the day, capitalists are interested in mass, not rate, quite properly. And this is one of the key things that arises here, and it's interesting that Marx is actually spelling this out in the Grundrisse, very simply by saying, well, there's a simple rule here: relative surplus value means falling rate of profit. People, looking at this a falling rate of profit, will go out and find ways to employ more laborers, so that that means more output, and it means more demand to create the world market. It means all kinds of things. And then when we look at the social problems associated with that, can you get from a theory of the falling rate to understanding climate change and carbon emissions? And the answer is it's very hard to do it. I mean, you can make all kinds of assumptions and do it. It's very simple, however, when you talk about the rising mass. And you say it's the rising mass. And the impulsion for the rising mass, and one of the big problems about the climate change literature, is it doesn't actually talk about the rising mass as being the heart of the problem. But it is the heart of the problem. And so then the problem is how to keep the mass rising at the same time as you don't actually increase carbon emissions. So when you get to any of these things, you find out that the rising mass is very crucial, and has a lot to do with explaining where a lot of the volatility of capital is coming from. And has a lot to explain about, environmental degradation in general, climate change in particular, increasing inequality, because also it's so interesting just looking at what's going on in the banking system right now. Everybody's kind of going, we think small community banks, because they're close to people, are very good to have and all this kind of stuff. And all the small community banks are really getting into trouble. And what's happening? We're getting an increasing centralization of capital. Huge centralization. Okay? So much that, Jamie Dimon can come on and say JP Morgan Chase is far, far too big to fail. Okay? And the other banks can fail because they haven't got the mass. You can't do this. You can't possibly do this to Chase. And of course, one of the interesting things is it might be done to Chase if those crazies in the Republican Party refuse to raise the debt limit. In which case, the top will come off the whole thing. And quite literally, what you will see is that capital is right now is essentially one big Ponzi scheme, in which you borrow money to pay the interest on and we know what happens to Ponzi schemes. At some point they get discovered. Well, but actually, the US has been running a Ponzi scheme for about the last 40 years, and if you actually go bankrupt and crash the debt limit, the Ponzi scheme is over. And a lot of other things are over too, so it's just kind of interesting moment. So Marx then is talking about this question of falling rate and rising mass, and doing it in a very specific way. There's a very interesting and elegant way also in which, faced with the falling rate of profit, capitalists do a number of things, employ more labor, but they also repress wages in order to stabilize their profits. At the same time as they're employing more laborers to ensure a greater gross profit in the face of a falling rate of profit. So the falling rate of profit is, some people say I'm against the falling rate of profit. I'm not. It's a very important part of this argument. But what is not, what the economists don't typically take up is the other part of the argument, which is crucial. But one of the things that then happens, of course, if that, given this relationship, is that the capitalists themselves get wealthier, enormously so. They're repressing wages, they're employing more workers, they're actually expanding the surplus value which they're capturing very significantly, and as a result of that, when you get into this kind of mechanism, you're actually in a mechanism which is creating more and more social inequality. It's creating billionaires left, right, and center at the same time as it's repressing wage levels for the mass of the population, and requiring also an expanding population. And several times, as you will remember in the Grundrisse, Marx talks about the relationship between the accumulation of capital and the accumulation of people, i.e. the population growth and the expansion of population. So that is also part and parcel of what is going along here. So this is the part of the argument which is being stretched out here. There are, however, various other aspects of the falling rate of profit, which are compensatory. In the face of a falling rate of profit, one of the things that you do is to create new branches of production in which more direct labor exists in relation to capital, or where the productive power of labor is not yet developed. And this is on page 751, where Marx talks about this. And this is you open up new labor-intensive lines of production. And historically, I think that we've argued a lot about, well, okay, there's a tendency towards a falling rate of profit, but there are many industries in which it's very difficult to accomplish the replacement of labor and to increase the productivity of labor. And there are many industries which, when they grow up, are labor-intensive until they get rationalized. And so if you look at the history of automobile production, for example, in the 1960s, most car plants employed about 30,000, 40,000 people. So it was a huge labor force. The labor force then gets reduced by automation and modernization and all the rest of it. So in a particular sector, you often see a shift from a labor-intensive to a capital-intensive production model. And that often happens in what's called the production cycle. But new products coming on are very often labor-intensive until there comes such time and some are labor-intensive and remain labor-intensive simply by their very nature. So that when we take the care industry, for example, it's very difficult to imagine that being, well, I suppose we could now imagine it being run on the basis of artificial intelligence, but up until now, that is a very labor-intensive sector of the economy. Tourism tends to be a very labor-intensive sector of the economy. So labor-intensive sectors tend to persist in some areas, and so Marx talks about all of these features. And these new branches of production, of course, mean the opening up of new markets. And that means opening up new lines of consumption, so new forms of consumerism. And what I suggested is you think about, for instance, look at the average household equipment. In Marx's day, most people would have just a bed, a table, a couple of chairs, a fireplace, and a couple of pots and a few mugs, and that would essentially be it. But even the poorest household in the United States today will have a range of kitchen equipment. There's likely to be a stove. There's likely to be several plates and things, and you don't have to go very far up the income scale, and you find coffee grinders and coffee making machines and vacuum cleaners and refrigerators. And I mean, think of the range of consumer durables in the average household now compared with the range of consumer durables in an average household when Marx was writing. And you would say, well, actually, there's been a huge expansion of the market. And that huge expansion of the market is part and parcel of that transformation into mass production and mass consumption on an expansionary basis, so that you then see all of these things coming into various parts of the world, like you go to Brazil or somewhere, or you go China or something, and a significant middle class with huge demand for these kinds of things. So there are lots of processes at work which are about expanding the terrain of circulating capital, and at the same time trying to deploy more and more fixed capital to improve the productivity of labor. So these processes are at work, and Marx is very explicit about them. So the foundational point in all of this is that fixed and circulating capital have to be brought together in such a way as to create profit and create surplus value. There are therefore important things to be worked out also about the relationship between the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value. The rate of profit is simply the amount of surplus value relative to the total deployment of capital, whereas the rate of surplus value is the rate of surplus value relative to the deployment of variable capital or the employment of labor. Obviously, the rate of exploitation, which is the rate of exploitation, is higher than the rate of profit. The rate of profit is always significantly lower than the rate of exploitation, and this is leading to also imbalances within the economy, that because capitalists work on the basis of profit rather than working on the basis of surplus value. And this is going to lead to Marx talking very briefly about what happens with the equalization of the rate of profit. And as he says that there is an equalization of the rate of profit through competition. When profit rates are high in one sector, people will take their money from one sector, from wherever the rate of profit is low, and go into a high, so the equalization of the rate of profit takes place, which in effect creates what Marx calls a capitalist communism, in which the contribution to surplus value depends upon how much labor you employ, whereas the distribution of the surplus value depends upon how much capital you advance. And you can imagine a situation in which somebody who employs no labor at all, fictitious firm, if you like, of no labor at all, will still end up getting the average rate of profit. And that's what the laws of competition, the social laws of competition do, that they redistribute things in such a way, and Marx kind of calls this a form of capitalist communism, because it's from each capital according to the labor you employ to each capital on the basis of the capital you advance. And the result of this is that capital-intensive industries tend to be subsidized by labor-intensive industries. And this is a kind of very interesting, has an interesting geopolitical dynamic, because what this says is that, okay, if you're in a country which has capital-intensive situation, then you're being subsidized by all of those countries which are producing goods with labor-intensive. Now, if you look at the patterns over the last 40 years, of course, labor-intensive industries have been opening up all over the place, particularly in Bangladesh, China, Mexico, and all the rest of it. And they are, in effect, subsidizing those countries like the United States, which have capital-intensive configurations. Now, I think, I'm not sure, that the Chinese recognize that. So one of the things the Chinese argued was that they needed to move from labor-intensive configuration to a capital-intensive. So they had this kind of idea that they were going to move, and if they did that, then the flow of value which goes from China to the United States would be diminished a great deal, and China would start to actually get a flow of value running into it because of its capital-intensive industry structure once it is created. So Xi kind of made this promise that China was going to become a capital-intensive economy by 2025, and made a lot of noise about it. And the United States basically said, "To hell you are," and has spent a lot of time trying to cut them down and stop them, and under no circumstances, because very simply, over the last 40 years, the United States has had a transfer of value from China, very significant. And the well-being of the U.S. population has depended very much on that transfer of value. If that transfer of value disappears from China, then the U.S. will be much less well off. Of course, there are other places which are not going to be able to do that. Bangladesh is one of them. There's a very significant industrial structure in Bangladesh, but it's labor-intensive, textile kind of structures. And labor-intensive economies are elsewhere won't be able to do what China is able to do. But China's determination to become a capital-intensive economy, and there is also associated, of course, with the impact of the one-child policy, which means that labor is becoming much scarcer in China, and as it becomes much scarcer, the wage rates are going to rise, and China's competitive advantage in terms of low-wage labor industries is going to disappear. Okay, and to the extent that disappears, then the labor-intensive economies are going to have to end up somewhere else. So this is what a lot of the competition now currently going on, and a lot of the China policy of the United States is about trying to prevent China becoming a capital-intensive economy. And the Chinese are determined to do it. They're even offshoring some labor-intensive factories and so on into Thailand and Laos and even into Bangladesh, so that there is a kind of a geopolitical struggle going on over capital intensity and labor intensity within the global economy. Now, this is this transfer of value that arises because of this is actually creates some very interesting features. For instance, if you talk to you read the press in Germany, they all talk about the way in which the Greek economy is basically populated by cultural inferior production people, and in fact, lazy Mediterranean types who kind of like to sit around and drink wine and those kinds of things. So that the picture of the Greek economy is one which is kind of one where during the economic crisis, the Germans were being asked to help bail it out, and kind of said, "Why should we? We work hard and they don't. Why should we?" But actually what this analysis shows is that the labor-intensive economy in Greece actually subsidizes Germany, which is when you start to point that out to German scholars, they get very upset, because this is completely, but you can see the logic that actually the labor, the problem that Greece had of being a low-wage, labor-intensive economy inserted into the European Union with no protections against the superior productivity of German industry found itself basically failing. Essentially, feeding value into the German economy rather than Germans feeding it the other way. So capital intensity of an economy is a terribly important policy decision. And what you find is that the US has a very distinctive policy about that. First off, it's committed to capital intensity and innovation, in part for military reasons. So the military side of this is very important, and that also is arising in relationship to the China contest. So that there is that side of it. The second side of it, interestingly, is how much the United States actually depends upon innovative works elsewhere, which it actually imports. So if you look at things like the space program, both the private and the public, a lot of the people in it are Russian, and they came out of what was the Soviet Union. And the same thing applies with the sort of software development coming out of Bangalore in India has been very strong and gets imported into Silicon Valley and Seattle and so on. So you'll find what the US does is to buy up talent from elsewhere. For instance, Britain had a very super group of quantum computer experts, and the United States just went wholesale and basically bought them all out and put them in California somewhere. So the U.S. has a policy in terms of immigration, in terms of actually stealing talent from all over the world, and then gets mad as hell when the Chinese do the same sort of thing. So this is part of what we're seeing. So the equalization of the rate of profit, which Marx talks about very briefly here, has all of those implications. And at the same time, what we're seeing is geopolitical consequences of much of this. So Marx comes back and he reiterates many times, which is why I tend to also the importance of the growing mass. And as he says, it is clear further that although the part of capital exchanged for living labour declines in relation to the total capital, the total mass of living labour employed can increase or remain the same if capital grows in the same or a larger relation. Hence, a constant growth in the population may accompany a relative decline in necessary labour. The growth of population and all the social powers associated with the growth of population and with the historic development of society actually cost capital nothing. So capital is going to exploit knowledge, it's going to exploit all these things and not pay for it. And capital, as Marx says, happily expropriates all of the free gifts of nature and of society. And some of those free gifts in the United States are trained talent from abroad who the brain drains which the United States actually organizes to take talent from the rest of the world and bring it into this country. And again, it's kind of interesting. Not only do you have the debt ceiling kind of problem, which is going against what is very powerful for the United States, but increasingly the anti-immigrant politics of the United States is having a very negative effect in the sense of creating barriers to further accumulation within the United States on the basis of increasing the mass. That you're not allowed to bring in more people. You're not, so that There's always these exceptions, of course, so it wasn't as if the quantum computing people got rejected at the border. They certainly did not, but a lot of the more manual labor does get rejected, and that is a problem. So we were in this situation then that the relationship between fixed capital and circulating capital gets projected into all of this argument about the falling rate of profit, the equalization of the rate of profit, the rising mass, and all the rest of it. And at the same time, it's also underpinning our understanding of why it is that in the history of capital, the pressure to create mass production and mass consumption is very strong. And why it is that the search for extra labor becomes very strong, so that the extra billion wage laborers that joined the labor force since 1980, mainly because both the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the introduction of the Chinese labor force into the global situation, this is a huge increase in wage labor availability on the global stage in the context of these other processes about the equalization of the rate of profit and the subsidies that get set up. So these are some of the questions which are set up in here. So I maybe ask if there are any kind of issues you want to raise, any points you want to make. Anybody got any? Can we get the microphone into the? Anybody got any kind of questions?
Thank you. This might be a very basic question, but
that's good.
I'm struggling with what you're describing as the value transfer between labor-intensive industries or labor-intensive economies and capital-intensive economies. Does that transfer happen? Why does that transfer happen? Does that transfer happen because the labor-intensive economies located in one place are owned by capitalists somewhere else? How does that subsidization actually come to pass?
Yeah, let me see about that. It's something that happens through the market. It's a market process. And it says that when I trade a labor-intensive commodity, I trade it at a lower price than its value. Okay? So those who are receiving it are going to benefit from the fact that they're paying a lower price, they're not paying the full value. So that's basically the mechanism that's involved. I don't know if that... and this leads, by the way, it's interesting. You know, in the history of economics, in economic theory, there have been phases where the idea of universal competition and free trade is assumed to be beneficial to everyone. But when you look carefully as to who is it who sets that agenda and pursues it vociferously, it's, in Marx's time, it was the Manchester industrialists, the high-tech, big machine factory producers. Okay. Now, the difficulty with this is that this is something that occurs through, like I'm saying, the labor-intensive economies that has a lot of value is going to be traded at a price less than that value. Conversely, the capital-intensive commodities, it's going to be the other way around. They're going to be traded at a price which is above their value when they go to another country. So when we think of this, we think of transfer of value between sectors, and we also think about transfer of value from one country to another. I like the one country one. It's simpler. Another way, the way conventional economics talks about this, and they do have a slight way of talking about it, is the terms of trade. And in particular, the terms of trade of raw materials and commodities. And if the terms of trade are very adverse to for the producing countries, and there's a whole historical structure of that being the case, so that countries will give up their minerals, give up their oil, give up their access to their agricultural capacities and so on, will give that up for not very much. Whereas the capitalist countries will take more than, will not, so when you trade, say, unrefined copper against, I don't know, bicycles or something. When you look at the trade, what you'll see is that there is an imbalance in the trade, that the prices are going to be equalized, but the prices are distorted because the price is going to reflect the capital intensity of the economy as much as it is. So this is how. So you don't see it yet. You then look at those countries which spend a lot of time trying to resist open markets. China has been very, it was admitted to the WTO, and one of the rules of the WTO, given that what WTO was really the vehicle by which the capital-intensive economies imposed a global order. China came into the WTO in 2000 or so, 2001, I can't remember exactly when, came in to the WTO, but it said, we cannot drop all capital controls and all tariffs and all the rest of it immediately because, we need a transition time. And of course, there's then the kinds of fiddling around of those. So a lot of these, you see, a lot of these arguments. What I like about Marx's commentaries here is a lot of these arguments make sense when you see one of the points that Marx is making. That in the event, let's assume that's correct. That there is this transfer of wealth. Then, well, you get. You get the kinds of conflicts which you're now seeing. I mean, why is it that the United States is so? If the United States was a guardian of global capitalism, it should surely welcome China becoming capital intensive. But why is the United States so crazily antagonistic? Well, part of it comes from the supposed military threat and all of that kind of stuff. All right. And I can understand that. I don't agree with it at all, but but why? But where's that coming from? And I think one of the things that I think this transfer of value tells you is, well, if it's coming from somewhere which has a certain economic logic to it, and right at the end of the Grundrisse, there are these two little scribs about Bastiat and Carey, the two. One is a U.S.-based economist, and Bastiat is French-based. Their take on what the proper policy should be was entirely different. Bastiat, in a country where there's a lot of regulation of movement and all this kind of stuff, was an advocate of laissez-faire, let it be open. At the time in the middle of the 19th century in the United States, you see the United States effectively being, exploited by Britain because the terms of trade were very strong. That British steel and British locomotives and British technology and British know-how was dominating everything. So Carey was kind of saying, we need to protect our industries. So we're not in favor of free trade. So Britain was advocating free trade at that time. The United States was saying, protect the infant industries. Because they need protection, because otherwise, they're either going to be destroyed by the competition from the superior productivity of British industry, and B, the kind of the transfer of value is not going to be there, though the transfer of value is something that's very hard to calculate and very hard to see. Yeah.
Hi. I can have 3 questions if you have the time to answer all. Okay, so I was following for the most part online on my way here, so forgive me if I'm asking about things that you maybe covered at some point. But I'll go back at this issue of declining rate of profit versus the mass. And you mentioned that it's vague, it's ambiguous whether Marx is saying this is like about Ricardo or about his own view of this. But my impression before was that the declining profit rate, my impression was that this is the grand crisis of capitalism, like the grand finale of capitalism in Marx's viewpoint. So, but now you're saying, okay, this might not be the issue or the real issue. Let's discuss the mass itself. So I want, if you can elaborate on that declining rate of profit in relation, or in the context of crisis, of the long run crisis. And now, especially with what you mentioned, not from exogenous perspective, but like internally with the increasing role and part of fixed capital in production and so on. The second thing about when you were talking about the mass, I immediately became curious to ask you about your viewpoint on theories of degrowth that are discussed, which I claim to be a Marxist and claim to hate. So please tell us about it. And the third point is, what do you think about many people who, like Cohen and others, who look at Marx as technological determinist? Also, I'm curious to hear your opinion on that.
Well, the last question. If there's any determinism in Marx, it's going to be a determinism of the social relations rather than a determinism of the productive forces. Marx is very clear that the technology can be used for socialism, or it can be used for capitalism. So he's very much in favor of technologies which can liberate free time. That's roughly where he's coming in, just in terms of the text of the Grundrisse, that's where he's saying, and that therefore the emancipated laborer depends upon the ability to mobilize free time to their own freedom. So that's very, very significant. The question of falling rate of profit, there's no question that it it inserts a serious contradiction into the organization of a capitalist economy. But it's not the only contradiction. And I think there's a real problem when you kind of say there's only one contradiction that matters. I would say that I would point out, for example, that the crisis of 2007-2008, in what sense was that a crisis of the falling rate of profit? No, it was a crisis of fixed capital and consumption fund formation. And as Marx hints in here, that all of that consumption fund and fixed capital of an independent kind in the built environment and all the rest of it, all of that is if it's going to be funded, can only be funded by the creation of a credit system. So that therefore it was impossible for there to be a crisis of in the built environment, which is where it all originated, in the housing built environment, impossible to have that crisis, which did not then flow over into the credit system, which had been deeply implicated in the creation of the subprime situation. Now, again, one of the things that's interesting to me is most people talk about 2007, 2008, they talk about it as a financial crisis. And I go, well, wait a minute, it was a housing crisis. And it was a crisis over housing. and yes, of course, it had implications for the credit system. And the credit system was being structured in such a way as to facilitate more and more investment in the built environment, not necessarily in the production of housing, as in the purchase of housing. In other words, it was most of the money that flowed in was flowing into mortgage finance, which is jacking up consumer demand for housing, with of course not too much production of housing, which meant that housing prices started to go. So yeah, it had a structure. So I kind of look at all of that, and then somebody comes along and says, well, it was a manifestation of the falling rate of profit, and I go, wait a minute, no, I mean, come on, you know, the falling rate of profit is important, and I'm happy with it, but then when you have something like 2007, 2008, now. You then look at some of the issues that have arisen in China recently. What happened? China invested a huge amount of money in the built environment after 2007, 2008, because that's the only way it could actually create jobs in a situation where they were threatened with unemployment because of a collapse of the consumer market in the United States. So we got into a crisis because of housing. China got out of it by building like crazy, and just you know the highway system and the high-speed rail network system and the cities that had no residents and all those kinds of things going on. And about a couple of years ago, people started to say, well, wait a minute, there's a bit of a problem here. And so we suddenly find Evergrande goes close to bankrupt. All of the developers are having problems, and so we've got a real problem of in China, which is a replica of what happened in California, 10 years before, 15 years before. So here you have a repetition of a crisis scenario, which is very much about built environment. It's about what was being talked about in here. That when this stuff goes wonky and gets out of whack, then all sorts of issues arise. So I'm saying the single-minded focus that exists in many Marxist circles on a falling rate of profit is missing the point. again, I don't want it to be said that I'm against the falling rate of profit. It plays a role. It is a particular mechanism which is very significant, but it plays a role. But you have to look at all of the other elements. And I use this analogy when I talk about the different circulatory processes of the human body, and kind of say, you know, the people on the falling rate of profit are simply doing the equivalent of saying, you know, human beings. When human beings die, their heart stops beating. Therefore, the only cause of death is heart problems. You kind of go, wait a minute, you know. Yeah, to be sure, you know, if your liver fails, then at some point or other your heart fails too. So you know, so yes, you can be technically right, but you're not doing a proper diagnosis. So the proper diagnosis, I think, is where are the crises coming from, and a lot of the crises over the last 30, 40 years have strong elements of the property market, the housing market, the commercial property market, and the financial configurations around that. And if you go back over the last 40 years, you find, okay, the Japanese boom came to an end because of the land and property market was one of the big things. Sweden ran into big problems and had to nationalize the banks because of the property market. The property market in the United States, which was particularly in American West and Southwest and American South, particularly was another such event. Thailand in 1997-98, property market. I would bet that at least half of the crises that have come about in various countries over the past 30 or 40 years have been property market, land market, financing thereof. I think, yeah. So I think this is why I think what's in the Grundrisse is so significant, because it's actually talking about the dynamics of what goes on in fixed capital and consumption fund formation of an independent and immobile kind. I mean, it's sort of in there as being a valid topic that we need to work on. Degrowth. Yeah, I'm not in favor of degrowth. I'm in favor of refashioning what growth is about. And for instance, and Marx talks about one of the sad things about capital is that it fails to grow in a way that accommodates and encourages human capacities and powers. So the growth of human capacities and powers is actually a terribly important objective. I can say that I'm in favor of degrowth of the military-industrial complex and things. If you give me a specific area, I would, yeah, let's get rid of that. But what Marx is really talking about is a form of growth. And actually, what was very interesting about the United Nations, they always produce this World Report. And in I've forgotten when it was 1990s or something like that, they started to say, well, the World Report doesn't really cover things like how happy people are or how contented and all those kinds of things. And are there indicators of well-being which go beyond, the standard ideas of growth? So they started to produce a well-being kind of thing. And they actually produced some very interesting reports, but after a bit, the powers that be decided this is going too far. You want the directions of growth that were indicated where you should invest things were not to the liking of the big corporations. They were not enjoying this at all. So the well-being stuff started to disappear. But if you had an atlas of well-being, as opposed to an atlas of you would talk about the growth of human capacities and powers, the growth of cultural powers and so on. So I'd rather sort of use a language which actually embraces growth, but talks about a different kind of growth with a different kind of imaginary in terms of what it is that you're trying to do with the growth. I mean, you're trying to make Jeff Bezos richer and richer and richer, or are you trying to actually set up a situation of affordable housing? You know, and you look at the patterns of growth right now. So the problem is not growth per se; it's what the growth is doing and what it's for.
So I'm thinking about fixed capital and circulating capital. I was wondering how to think about myself as sort of a taxpayer who I just feel like every time there is some kind of financial crisis or market instability, none of that seems guaranteed, but what does seem guaranteed is the fact that I'm still paying taxes that are subsidizing or bailing out large industry or social security. And so, I don't know, just wondering how to think about that structurally. Like, are we all paying taxes into something that would be considered fixed capital that is like a reliable bailout, or, yeah, just how to conceptualize that, or if that's useful?
Well, fixed capital rests upon having surpluses of capital, and those surpluses are mobilized in part through taxation. And, you know, the argument is that if you tax well, you can actually put it into investments in the built environment, which will encourage development, which will increase the property taxes, so there's a kind of a state-led kind of circuit which goes on there. And on the other hand, but they then will say, as I've heard mayors in various places say, you know, we need the growth in order to get the tax and the revenue so that we can actually create the playgrounds and improve the schools and do all the things that you might want to be done to make your neighborhood a safer and more pleasant place to live. And we love to do that, but right now we can't do that because we don't have enough revenue. The only way we can get more revenue is to invest in hotels or, you know, and get money from Hilton or something like that. So yeah, the whole circulatory process. Marx didn't get into very much about the circulation of revenues, and particularly tax revenues. And when I think of what we have to do to complete Marx's project, that's one of the circulatory processes that needs to be looked at. And there's enough conventional literature about a lot of that to be able to do that.
On that note about sort of things that Marx he planned to write a whole bunch, but he didn't pass, you know, volume 1 really, kind of volume 2, volume 3. But sort of thinking about how you were talking about the dialectical method and use value, exchange value, and have you ever, you know, and you said at the end you thought about fictitious capital and real capital as being a contradictory unity, and you know, have you ever thought, has anyone, I'm wondering, have you thought about, and has anyone else tried to extend Marx's project using that method according to what he had originally planned? Because surely in principle it would be possible if it's always this kind of binary contradiction, something that reconciles or overcomes the binary.
You know, it'd be very hard for me to answer that question. I mean, in the history of Marxism, there's an enormous literature there. When I first got into Marx, I tried to get into a lot of that literature, and I got through some of it. In recent times, I've just kind of given up that quest. So I mean, there are authors like Otto Bauer and so on who I think did some extremely interesting things. There are bits and pieces of of stuff I have come across, like I read Henri Lefebvre, for example, and I read stuff about social reproduction and so on. So there are pieces of the architecture that Marx set up but did not complete, which have been followed through. For instance, the whole kind of question of finance and financialization and finance capital. Now there's an extensive literature on that. In a way, if I was critical of much of it that I've seen and tried to follow, what's missing is this notion of the totality. There's a tendency to sort of say, okay, we've got to look at financialization, and we look at financialization. And so there's a strong literature about that, some of which is very perceptive and very, I think, and the bourgeois literature can be helpful too. I mean, I think that Marx would never have been able to write this without the dialogue with Ricardo. So I think that, if we want to get into any of that, we don't say, the bourgeois analysts are all full of bullshit, so, forget it. I don't think we can afford to do that at all. I think there are some very significant things that... but I think to me, one of the things that really comes out of the Grundrisse is the importance of the totality in its moments and so on. And I haven't seen anybody sort of take that dialectical unfolding and kind of run with it and sort of say, well, this really points immediately to. I think it's really clear that in here it really points to the credit system and an analysis of the credit system that Marx only partially accomplished in Volume 3 of Capital, and which needs a lot more work. But in that context, he does point out that this concept of fictitious capital, which is capital which is circulating, as capital which is permanently unvalorized. It never gets there, So it's banks supporting banks, and banks, so the fictitious capital becomes a very important category, which I would think should be worked on. And Marx talks about some of that, and again a duality comes in, and to the degree that debt is a claim on future labor, then that means that those who issue the debt and create the debt are in fact dictating the future. And he at some point he's talking about these bankers in Second Empire Paris, or the Pereire brothers, and he said they had the charming character of swindlers and prophets. That is prophetic of the future. And I think that's a very interesting dialectic, I mean, again, it's one of Marx's kind of dualities that he sets up, and you kind of think, yeah, those people are like that. I mean, you look at some of the Wall Street people; they're often seers into the future, and they're actually dictating the future at the same time as they're swindling everybody like hell. So it's kind of rather interesting way. So there are various ways in which you could look at it, but again, I would not argue that there's a singular path. I mean, I started off with Capital on a singular path, but when you get into here, I think you see numerous byways in which you can, it's a bit like the number of ways in which your blood flows within you. There's all these complex networks, and I think there are networks of contradictions which I find fascinating and interesting.
David, I wonder if you could comment a little more. You mentioned about First Republic Bank collapsing over the weekend, which became the second biggest bank bailout in U.S. history, and which we had Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank failing in March, and Credit Suisse, and that it certainly seems that although Biden declared the banking system safe and sound,
of course,
yes, that there's there's really a fixed capital dynamic that many observers are very worried about, in the sense of a commercial real estate crisis that's we seem to be right on the edge of. And just wondering if you have any thoughts of what's the next shoe to drop here.
Yeah, on this, you need to have the kind of information, and I'm confined a bit to the Financial Times, which I'm a bit of an addict of. Partly because I think the Financial Times is one of the few newspapers that tries to speak the truth to power. It's pro-capitalist, but it's trying to say, watch out. There's some stupid things happening here. So I wish I was a seer and I had my crystal ball, but I do hear from the Financial Times worries about commercial property. And of course, the one of the big shoes to drop is the whole question of what's going to happen to office space. And as people are pointing out, most of the leases and so on are, most people, when they lease office space, do so for 5 years or 3 years or something of that kind, and a lot of that. The problems there is sort of about to be a wave of a renegotiation of leases, and the renegotiations of leases are likely to have to take account of the fact that this working from home is more and more significant. Interestingly, what that does is it turns your home into a form of fixed capital, and it diminishes the big towers of fixed capital over there, and so we're likely to see this in a couple of years' time, and that will almost certainly implicate, the problem that we've got a two-tier financial system right now: those that are supposedly tightly regulated because they were too big to fail, and then those who got lessened, got off, and they're the ones where you're seeing the stress right now. But I think that, so I don't think there's likely to be a humongous crisis until something hits the big ones, and the leasehold kind of thing could be big enough. But it's so interesting that what you find is that when something like that happens, then political power simply immobilizes the state apparatus. And what does the state apparatus do? It just basically unleashes waves and waves of liquidity. It just pour money into it and hope. And they tried that with, TARP back in, but they didn't pour enough of it, nowhere near enough of it. This time around, they realized they needed to pour more of it, so there's all the quantitative easing and all of that sort of stuff. And it's about rescuing the financial system all the time, not about rescuing people from the immediate problems of which are also likely to come up of wage, that mechanism that Marx saw Ricardo using, which is the profit squeeze mechanism. I think when inflation jumps up high, then the profit squeeze can start, and so we we can get a profit squeeze crisis of the sort that existed in the 1960s and 1970s, which wasn't a falling rate of profit, wasn't a sign of it. And 2007, 2008 was not a falling rate of profit, it was finance of real estate. So yeah, I think the commercial thing is likely to be there, but I would not imagine it would crest until about 2 or 3 years' time. But that's the best I can do. So get your money out of. But where do you put it? Gold bars? Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, we should, I guess, close it down soon. Next week, there's a little bit of a residual. We won't spend too much time on the last few pages. They're mainly, Marx didn't have a photocopying machine or anything like that. So he copied loads and loads of stuff out in the British Museum, and you have no idea what he would have done with it. So there's a lot of stuff like that in the next few, in the rest of the book. There are some very interesting comments. He definitively lays out the idea that financiers form a class. You may want to call it a class faction. But the stuff about the banking class and the financial class and the role of the financial class is there. So take a look at that. But the main thing I would suggest you look at is that I appended my own kind of thing at the end of saying, okay, what's the political point of a lot of this, and what are the main issues that arise out of the Grundrisse? So it was my take on it. So we might want to talk about that. And as a conclusion to the whole thing. So please come prepared to talk a little bit about what it is that you might have gotten out of this, and what kinds of politics flow out of it, and what kinds of where can we take this, and where should we take this? Will be I'd like to be the theme if we can bring ourselves to do that. Okay. So okay, with that, so thank you very much, and we will see you last time next week.
Thank you all for coming. See you next Tuesday. Thank you.